Geopolitics. The participants are Anil Trigunayat, former diplomat, and Professor Harsh Pant, strategic analyst. The moderator is Simran Sodhi, journalist.
Today, we are discussing the evolving dynamics of geopolitics. And we are also just at the end of what we have seen a very successful tenure for India's G20 presidency. We saw the Delhi Declaration, and overall, the summit has been a huge success. Ambassador Trugnath, if you were to look at the overall success of G20, which India hosted this year, the Delhi Declaration coming out with 100% consensus, how much do you think this adds as a diplomatic achievement for India, the success of G20?
Well, Simranji, I think that until a couple of days before the Delhi summit, people were generally very cagey about whether this Delhi Declaration will at all happen or not, because the statements made by the Russians, by the Europeans and others were vertically divided and opposed. And so it was a great work by our diplomats, our Sherpa, and the leadership. I think that what pulled it off, in my view, is possibly the Prime Minister Modi's connect with the global leaders. And that is something, that's why many of them would like Indian presidency to be a success. And secondly, they had seen that the majority of the world, which got involved through India's efforts in the global south, were really, they realized the weight is moving towards that. So I think that this is something that is absolutely, I would say, remarkable. And the credit and kudos must go to our negotiating teams that did put up a draft that was eventually acceptable to everyone. There are always words here and there that people talk about, commentaries are made. But at the end of the day, what counts most in such situations is the result and the outcome. But in my view, more than the Delhi Declaration, a greatest achievement for India in this time has been the inclusion of the African Union into the G20 under India's presidency. And that is something I think will have a very long-lasting impact, G20 going forward.
Dr. Pant, if you were to expand on to what Ambassador Trugnath has just said, one, of course, is the inclusion of the African Union into the G20 and India's emerging as the voice of the global south and also being today in a leadership position. How much does the success of G20, the fact that we were able to come out with the statement in the backdrop of the Ukraine war, how much of heft does this lend to India's credentials as a global leader today?
Certainly, when you have a country like India trying to manage and bridge the divide, the geopolitical divide between East and West, the developmental divide between North and South, I think very few countries today are in a position to do that. And India is one of those rare countries that can accomplish such a feat. And it also perhaps underscores India's credibility as a power that is increasingly now shaping global outcomes, that is increasingly willing to invest diplomatically in areas where perhaps in the past it could not have, and increasingly therefore trying to provide solutions to global problems and thereby becoming a responsible global stakeholder. I think overall, if you look at the tapestry of the achievements, tapestry of the kind of outcome that are generated, I think it has been a very, very interesting inflection point. And the fact, as Ambassador was suggesting, that you have African Union entering, and this is a big deal because it changes the very character of the G20. It makes G20 much more representative. It makes G20 much look beyond just a conglomeration of some of the most prosperous economies in the world. And it brings squarely the issue of global south at the core of global development and governance agenda. Because I think from the very beginning, India's point was that if you don't bring in global south, if you don't bring in countries whose voices are not being heard at all amidst the geopolitical contestation that is going on, you are not going to advance the cause of global governance. And therefore, by bringing the global south to the center stage, and thereby framing all its approaches, whether it is on inclusive growth, whether on development, whether on digital divide, whether on climate, whether on gender, through the prism of the developing world, India perhaps ensured that the bigger powers, the major powers, had no particular reason to object and to contest the outcomes, as well as take this agenda beyond G20.
We also see that a very important development which took place on the sidelines of the G20 Leaders Summit was the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, which was announced. And we have a lot of analysis that has come out which says that the project, if completed, could act as a foil to China's Belt and Road Initiative. And this is a transnational rail and shipping route spread across two continents, which the US expects will energize the economic development through improved connectivity and economic integration between Asia, the Gulf, and Europe. And we also saw that Prime Minister Modi, while announcing the project, said that this will give the whole world connectivity and development sustainable direction. He said it will drive sustainable development for the entire world. Ambassador Trugnath, how much the excitement we have seen and the commentary we have seen which has come around this economic corridor, how much do you think is this realistic, and how much do you think this is going to be also a counter to what we have China's Belt Road Initiative?
Well, I think, Simranji, that whenever such big projects are announced, obviously there is a lot of interest in the public domain and the commentaries, and people try to compare one with the other. But let us not forget that two things. Number one, this is indeed a very big, very ambitious, and a very good alternative project for connectivity, which is extremely important, especially from India's point of view, because India and the West Asia or the Middle East are closest neighbors, extended neighborhood, very critical for each other's sustenance, especially for India, given the fact that we have energy, economy, and expatriate factors that work there. Relationship with most countries has become strategic in the region for India, where maritime connectivity is extremely important. Then, of course, but you have to look at it in a perspective. Perspective is this is a conceptual idea at the moment. It has to go forward. This indeed started in the beginning with the American President Biden talking about Build Back Better, which was a counter to the BRI, of which has its own downside in terms of debt traps and transparency issues and non-viability, etc., and then is currently under some stress. But they have a 10-year lead over many countries. 150 odd countries had signed up to the BRI, in which the countries which are our partner today, UAE and Saudi Arabia, and nearly whole of Middle East, is also part of the BRI. So I look at it as an alternative, not necessarily competing in terms of outreach by the BRI. Likewise, we also had started about 2 decades ago with the INSTC, a North-South Transport Corridor, where Russia, Iran, India, we were the part. Now we have just added Chabahar to that. So more the connectivity is there, more the trade, and it helps India becoming a greater partner in the new global and value supply chains that are going to come. Now, it will depend on how efficient it is, how quickly we are able to deal with the various customs issues, transportation issues, building the railway networks. Of course, it will go through, we have a Mudra port here, and we have a Haifa port in Israel, which is also owned by an Indian company. So all these certain connectivities for maritime route are very much there. Moreover, we need to understand that the UAE is our third largest partner, and Saudi Arabia is our fourth largest partner. So from the energy perspective, when the pipelines and for the hydrogen or for that matter gas are laid, and the digital connectivity is also further ensured, so I see that in this direction it will be much more faster between India and the Middle East section. Then the railways project which we are talking about has been talked about for a very long time. That is now China has also built roads, by the way, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. So these railways tracks have to be probably upgraded. They have to be made. In Jordan, there was a line which is from 1920s, but that is not being used anymore. So this is something that requires a tremendous investment and upgradation of the infrastructure before it really becomes a functional kind of a thing in near future. Moreover, it will depend on who's going to pay and pitch in for this. Saudi Arabia Crown Prince here, he said some ballpoint figure of about $20 billion. Let us see how others come up with. I doubt very much that the Europeans or the Americans are going to pitch in with a lot of funding. But it is something that needs to be watched. But all said and done, India would be a great beneficiary in this, and it provides us a different, as Prime Minister says, a perhaps sustainable trade route, an alternative trade route for the Indian businesses and for the regional businesses going onwards to Europe.
Dr. Pant, as Ambassador Trugnath also gave us a more realistic view of this project, we've also seen that in 2013, China had signed the BRI cooperation documents with more than 150 countries and with some over 30 international organizations. And China was able to mobilize nearly $1 trillion and they created over 3,000 projects. We also have the complexity that some of the countries that have signed on to this economic corridor are also part of the BRI, which includes Italy, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. Then there are some people who have pointed out the fact that China is slowing down because it is slowing down on BRI because of its own economy, which is not doing as well as was expected. Do you think all these factors add in and we might see the BRI slowing down? And with a sense of realism, as Ambassador Trugnath has explained, we see maybe an alternative or a new project coming up, realistically speaking.
See, BRI certainly is not going as strong as it seemed at one point in time. There are enormous challenges both within China as to what is happening to its economy. The headwinds are negative and the challenges are mounting. And therefore, China's primary, I think, focus for the foreseeable future is going to be domestic. Although there is a BRI summit happening in China next month, where we will see a lot of demonstration of Chinese renewed commitment to it. But I don't think any new money is coming in as far as BRI is concerned. And we have seen some crucial aspects of BRI facing tremendous problems. For example, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And the fact that a number of the countries that have signed on to it have also ended up in what the ambassador was saying, almost in a debt trap-like situation, adds, I think, to this broader perception that putting all one's eggs in Chinese basket is not necessarily the best strategy. So in that context, having alternative connectivity projects is a good thing. They are good, I think, for those regions which want to be part of the new global economic order, and they are good for smaller nations who want to get a better deal from whoever is giving them. So alternatives are always good. So in that sense, I think that the West, in particular the US, has woken up to the challenge relatively late, but nonetheless they have woken up that they need to show leadership on this issue of connectivity. For a long time, there have been questions and that your Build Back Better initiative has actually not translated into anything concrete. So I think in some ways, this realization has led US to push the India, Middle East, Europe corridor as well. If you think of US gaining out of it directly, I don't think US is a direct beneficiary. But as President Biden said, it's a really big deal from their perspective. It's their push that has brought seemingly contending parties like Israel and Saudis together. And they have brought Europeans to join in so that it becomes a pan-continental economic corridor where various leverages can be drawn and all stakeholders can benefit. It's a very ambitious and perhaps potentially a transformatory idea. The question, I think, is essentially, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. We will have to wait for the next 60 days when the expert committee report is coming. So I think we have to wait and watch on this ground. But certainly the sheer fact that so many countries, so many stakeholders are today invested in it is a sign that there is a fatigue building up with China's BRI. You mentioned Italy as part of BRI. Italy is now largely on the verge of getting out of BRI. So I think that there is a great degree of despondency about BRI, especially in the West.
Ambassador Trugnath, we see another development that is happening soon is the visit of the Foreign Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. He is likely to travel later this month and attend the 78th session of the UNGA. And on the sidelines of the UNGA, there are expected to be the foreign ministers meet of both Quad and the SCO. One, do you feel that now we've had a very successful G20? India has gotten the African Union as a part of G20, and India has its own voice, evident by its membership of the Quad, the SCO1. Do you feel that now is the appropriate time for the UNSC reforms that have been in talks for a very long time? And two, both the Quad and the SCO, how do you look at India's membership in both these forums?
Well, as far as the membership of India in these forums are concerned, it clearly is indicative of India's new policy, which is A, strategic autonomy, and second is multi-alignment policy. Of course, China remains a factor in many of these. SCO, China is a lead, and in Quad, it has it indicates a little bit anti-China stance. So obviously, these are both countering in a sense to one another. But India is very much a part of it. And I maintain also that India eventually could also be a bridge between the two dividing entities that will eventually happen. But let's see, that is something very different. So that is India's policy, and we are engaged in everything. That is a nation initiative, and Quad also has intercontinental initiative. So India remains a part of both these and many others, including the BRICS, including the RIC, or for that matter, IPSA and others. Now, this G20 has definitely given a great heft to India. There is a great acknowledgement about India's power, India's capabilities, India's policies, which are broadly respected and taken note of by everyone who counts. Now, United Nations obviously has been under a lot of criticism, especially for not being able to reform itself or any reform proposals coming not moving forward at all. Now, that is something that even Guterres said himself, that if the UN does not reform, then it will probably die down. That is something that India has been saying. Prime Minister Modi has very clearly said during whether it is his 4-hour mantras, reform is very much there, whether it is part of the BRICS. There again, we are talking of the reforms of the multilateral institutions. In G20, we are talking of the multilateral reforms of all these institutions. But at the same time, the fact remains is that there are these fundamental contradictions in the United Nations itself. That is the P5 with a veto. These permanent 5 with a veto are the biggest threat to the global peace, in my view. And that's precisely what they were supposed to stop or not happen. But today, there is a recourse to it, and that is what is happening. So I think that the meetings of the Quad or SCO or many others, last time Jaishankar had more than 100 meetings on the sidelines of the UNGA. So you have bilateral meetings, you have trilateral, quadrilateral. It's so much easier because most of these foreign ministers are hanging around there all the time. So it's easier to do that, and you carry forward in a very efficient manner these conversations, important conversations with various countries. So the time is basically well spent in these negotiations, and you develop those. As far as the reforms are concerned, simply put, you may call it cynical or whatever it is, but I feel that UN must reform if it has to survive. But I don't see much chances of that happening at the moment, because see, the Chinese are not letting India be on the table. Now, the Americans and the British or the French or other Russia, even Russia also is on a here and there. Now, this is something that they know very well, that China is not going to allow India to be there. There are other problems in Europe itself about Germany, and in Brazil, you have other problems from Argentina. So there are these kind of things that equations play out. And so it's easier to say, okay, we support India's candidature. Now, we need not be very happy about it. It sounds good to reason. But until and unless there is a tremendous pressure, there is a tremendous commitment for the other countries who have the veto powers to work on it somehow, then only it can work. Otherwise, I don't see a great future happening there. That's why people are considering that perhaps G20 is a better organization to deal with those kind of global issues, even though it doesn't have any enforcement mechanism. But that's how things are moving. More countries are moving to BRICS. You are seeing more multilateral alignments, trilateral, plurilaterals. So that is a way the world is moving towards. Whatever serves your purpose, you join the organizations and work with it.
Dr. Pant, would you agree with this analysis of Ambassador Trugnath, which is slightly pessimistic but also very realistic? That, we do talk about the reforms of the UN, especially of UNSC, and, people, different countries have also said that we support India's candidature, but the proof lies eating the pudding. So we also see that actually, realistically, not much has happened. This is some story that we have been reporting and discussing for a long time. So do you feel that what Ambassador Trugnath has also very interestingly pointed out, that maybe that is the reason why more and more countries are joining forums like G20 and BRICS, because you feel that the UN today is just not a representative of the world that we live in?
Yes, indeed. I think, the whole United Nations Security Council issue and the reforms issue is something that we have been now talking about when I was a kid. And now I'm relatively old, and we are still discussing this issue. And I think we'll continue to do that, because I don't think there is any light at the end of the tunnel, given the structures and the processes of the UN itself. The decision to change the structure, the composition, the dynamic within the UN Security Council, it ultimately belongs to the five members who have veto, and that's why they are unlikely to change it. Although I must say that India itself is now increasingly taking a position which is quite significant on two counts. One, we have recently heard Dr. Jaishankar saying, for example, that perhaps the only reason we are not on the UNSC is because of China, because China's opposition continues to be very strong. The other is that there is a sense of nonchalance about India not being there that is also being reflected in the opinions of a number of our policymakers. I think Indian Prime Minister, for example, has often told the UN whenever he addresses it in the last 3 to 4 years that look, India not being part of it, 1.4 billion people not being represented at the UNSC, of course, is a bad news for India. But it is even worse for the UN's credibility. That if you don't have India present there, the credibility of the UN is at stake. And that is why I think increasingly India is positioning this issue as one where India is putting the onus on the United Nations itself, that you decide whether you want to be credible or not. And therefore, reforms become an issue for the UN to decide, not for India to invest its diplomatic capital on, because that's something that India can't do much about. We can talk about it. But at the end of the day, we are, in that sense, powerless to change. Where we have power, it's certainly to move away from UN and to create and develop our own frameworks, our own institutions, our own platforms, which allow us leverage to deal with global governance issues with like-minded countries. And that's exactly what seems to be happening when we see these multilaterals flourishing. There is a reason why that is happening, because the 1945 institutions do not really, both 1945 institutions do not really reflect the composition of the world as it exists today. They do not reflect today's realities, and therefore they are increasingly becoming redundant for many smaller nations and those nations that are not represented there. So therefore, the argument that India made as part of the G20 was, let's bring in greater representation to G20. Let's make G20 more reflective of present-day realities, which India did by building an African Union. So I think in that sense, India is charting a reasonable course that while we want to talk about UN Security Council reforms wherever we can, but ultimately that is not in our hands, so we will do other things. We will create our platforms, we will invest in other ways on other platforms, and we will devise our own mechanisms through which we can influence global governance, because ultimately as India's capabilities rise, India will have to show that it is invested and interested in global governance. It can't simply be in a position like in the past, to simply articulate its dissatisfaction and not do anything about it. And I think India is, therefore, the entire G20 presidency was also in some ways a response to that and a move in that endeavor. So I think by and large, UNSC reforms is a long shot, at least as of now, especially at this time in geopolitical contestation have once again increased. And therefore, India will have to find other ways of managing the challenges that it faces and managing the challenges that the global government faces.
Ambassador Trungnath, we also see that India's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ruchira Kamboj, she also made an important statement where she said that peace has always been an important part of India's rich cultural and philosophical heritage. She said this at the Discourse on the Peace event in New York yesterday. And she stated that the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi of non-violent resistance have influenced the country's approach to conflict resolution. And we all saw the photo of at the G20 where the leaders went and they paid their regards to Mahatma Gandhi at Rajghat. Do you feel, Ambassador Trungnath, that India, with its rich cultural heritage and its rich philosophy, is also in a unique position as far as soft power goes to also lead the world today in a world which is riddled with conflict and a lot of divisions as we see it?
I fully agree with our Ambassador Ruchira. She really recounted these facts on the UN Peace Day, which is being International Peace Day that is being celebrated there. Now, the fact remains is that this is a part of Shanti, that is part of our culture, our ethos, our way of life. In everything that we look for, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam means what? The whole world should remain in peace. And it is, frankly, that gives you kind of an outreach possibility in a very benign sense. So India's rise is seen as a benign power rising. which is for the global good and the global welfare. So that definitely gives India a certain advantage over very many countries compared to India. Moreover, India has always, even if it has its armed forces, others, they are said to be for the defense purposes. Non-violence, since Mahatma Gandhi was able to win India the freedom, that is something that is recorded, that is recognized, that is respected by the world, and everybody does so. So, in that sense, I think that this is what I believe that we India's heritage, cultural heritage, is such that it can take us to places. And you mentioned about soft power, smart power, cultural heritage. All these things combined have actually given India a very big lead in the global ranking, so to say, where they can speak with a moral authority. For example, I also believe that what position we took during the Russia-Ukraine war is not necessarily and simply driven by the Russian oil or our friendship with Russia, but was also driven by principles that dialogue, diplomacy, and peace are most essential, and that's the only way to going forward. And Richard also quoted Prime Minister Modi's this era of war thing. And I think that this is not an era of war. It is an era of peace. And for peace, everybody has to work together. And India is the right country to lead it forward.
Dr. Pant, if you could just do a brief wrap up for us. We've discussed G20, the economic corridor, and the upcoming UNGS session. Where do you place India today as a leader when it comes to global politics?
I would just add that, while certainly India has a strong cultural, civilizational heritage that needs to be articulated much better, I would also add that, in international relations, soft power alone will not help India. And therefore, when we talk of civilizational heritage, we do have a tradition of even the Bhagavad Gita, the idea that when injustice is being done, you should be willing to fight for it. So I think both hard power and soft power are extremely essential as a country like India makes its way up the global hierarchy. And I think that's what precisely India has been doing. That while we certainly want to highlight and we underscore our commitment to global peace, global harmony, global challenges being met by the community of nations, by pooling their resources together. I think when time comes, India should be standing up for the threats that it faces, and India has done that. Whether it is with regard to Pakistan, terrorism, and whether it is with regard to China's expansionism along the border. On both sides of the border, India's force projection, India's ability to deter its adversary has been amply demonstrated, and therefore that is also part of India's attraction today, that India today is a country that is talking about the wider global community, that is talking about the challenges of the world order, that is shaping global rules and outcomes, that is shaping new platforms, that is reinvigorating platforms like G20, but at the same time, it is also committed to defending its interests if and when they are threatened by external adversaries. And I think that's the essential message that is going out from India's behavior. And that is what is making India today very, very attractive proposition as a country to partner with, because it has greater credibility in the global community of nations. And that is why you see so many of India's partnerships becoming much more than simply something that is written on a piece of paper. Today, those partnerships are real, they are substantive, and they are delivering outcomes for India, for India's partners, as well as for the rest of the world.
And in the coming days, we will continue our discussions on many of the foreign policy issues, including the External Affairs Minister's visit to the UNGA. With these comments, we bring today's discussion to an end. Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on G20 and Evolving Geopolitics. The participants were Anil Trigunayat, former diplomat, and Professor Harsh Pant, strategic analyst. The moderator was Simran Sodhi, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.